Not all betrayals succeed. Not all silence is kept. The Flight of the Eisenstein is the fourth book in the Horus Heresy saga, and the first to ask a question no one else dared. What if someone survived? This is the story of Nathaniel Garro, captain of the Death Guard, a warrior who witnessed the truth of Isstvan III, a loyal son who refused to bow to the lies of his legion, a man who ran, not from fear, but to warn a galaxy that refused to believe. While the traitors prepared their war, Garro fought a different kind of battle. Aboard a dying ship, through the madness of the warp, against a corruption that no weapon could cut. This is not a tale of glory. It is not a tale of conquest. It is a tale of duty, of sacrifice, of a message carried through hell. The galaxy is about to burn. But first, someone had to light the beacon. The silence after genocide is a heavy thing. From the bridge of the Eisenstein, Captain Nathaniel Garro watched the smoke drift over Isstvan III. The planet below was no longer a war zone. It was a grave, and it hadn't died at the hands of Xenos or rebels. It had been murdered by their own. He stood alone at the viewport, gray-clad in his armor, body still and silent, as the fires of the virus bombing consumed what was left of a world that had once held brothers, not enemies, not heretics, brothers. Garro didn't speak. He didn't move. But something in him broke. He had known something was wrong. The moment the orders were given to deploy elite troops to the surface, then lock orbit, then unleash the virus bombs, he had felt it. Too coordinated, too perfect, too final. Now it was fact. The loyal had been sent down as sacrifices. The War Master, once the Emperor's brightest son, had turned. And Mortarion, his own Primarch, had stood beside him. The bridge of the Eisenstein was a tomb. The crew whispered. Many still followed the chain of command, but others had seen what Garro had seen. They looked to him not just as a commander, but as a question. What do we do now? Below them, Isstvan III was fire and ruin. The planetary atmosphere had ignited in a perfect storm of chemical combustion. Whole cities were vaporized. Nothing could have survived. And yet, Garro felt it in his bones. Some had. He thought of Sol Tarvitz, of Garviel Loken, of all those warriors who had stood in the name of the Emperor and been betrayed by their own legions. He remembered their oaths. He remembered his duty, loyalty, honor. Not to a man, not even to a Primarch, but to truth. He turned from the viewport and spoke 3 words to his bridge crew.
We're not done.
The halls of the Eisenstein felt colder than ever. Not from the void pressing against its hull, nor from malfunctioning systems. The chill came from the eyes of its crew, from the silences between words, from the tightening grip of suspicion that crept like rot through every corridor. Nathaniel Garro walked alone more often now. Not because he wished to, but because the air around him had changed. Where once he was greeted with salutes and respect, now came brief nods, downcast glances, words that stopped as he approached. He knew why. They had seen the same things he had, and unlike him, they had chosen silence. Typhon smiled too easily. The first captain of the Death Guard had always been difficult to read. Even before Isstvan, Typhon moved like a shadow behind Mortarion, whispering counsel, tightening his grip on the Legion's internal networks. Now, with the virus bombing complete, his mask was thinner than ever. He spoke to Garro as if nothing had changed, Routine check-ins, tactical debriefs, icy professionalism. But every word carried weight, a test, a challenge. And Garro gave him nothing, not defiance, not submission, only loyalty to the Emperor. And Typhon saw it. Ignatius Grulgor was worse. Where Typhon was subtle, Grulgor was arrogance given form. He no longer bothered with pretense. He made no secret of his contempt for Garro, calling him a fossil, a relic of an old legion that no longer existed. Grulgor mocked his faith, his stubbornness, his refusal to join the Lodge. The Lodge. That word again. It had become the dividing line in the Legion. Those who had sworn the new oaths and those who hadn't. Garro had refused, and that refusal had become a target painted across his back. Only a few still stood with him. Caleb, his personal housecarl, a mortal, loyal beyond words. Toll, the ship's commander, who trusted Garro more than his own officers. And a handful of warriors, quietly watching, waiting, unspoken loyalties, hanging by threads. Garro knew the walls were closing in. He just didn't know when the knives would come, but they would. And when they did, he would be ready. It started with the silence. Official channels went quiet. Orders from high command grew vague, contradictory. Communications with Terra were disrupted. The chain of command tightened, but not upward. It bent inward toward Typhon, toward the Lodge, toward something Garro could no longer pretend was his legion. He was not part of the plan. He was a variable, a problem, and problems get removed. In the dim chambers of his personal sanctum, Garro rewatched the Auspex recordings from Isstvan. Again and again, the atmospheric readings, the virus dispersal patterns, the ignition of the cloud layer. Nothing about it was tactical. It was extermination. He traced back orders, cross-checked deployment lists, names of loyal captains sent down in the first wave, men of honor, men like Saul Tarvitz. All gone. Garro didn't weep. He didn't rage. He simply knew. He knew what this was. Then came the whispers. Reports from ship crew, engine deck workers speaking in hushed tones. Scribes overheard in maintenance alcoves talk of rites, of symbols burned into bulkheads, of strange figures seen in the lower decks, hulking, robed, speaking languages no one recognized. And one name kept surfacing. Nurgle. Not an imperial code, not a sanctioned designation. A god. A thing. Garro did not want to believe it. But belief was no longer a luxury. In a locked armory, he met with the last loyal men under his command. He laid it out. The virus bombing, the silence, the Lodge, the strange rites, the corruption infecting their legion from within. He asked them for nothing. He gave them truth. And one by one, they stood. They would follow him. Not because he had answers, but because he had not lied. And in a legion drowning in betrayal, that was enough. It came without ceremony. No trial, no charges, no final warning. Ignatius Grulgor simply made his move. Under the pretense of a routine systems inspection, loyalist crew members began disappearing. Power fluctuations struck key sectors. Vox channels went dark. And then, without hesitation, the ship shook. Explosions. Localized, precise, coordinated, sabotage. The Eisenstein shuddered through its spine. Lights died. Grav stabilizers flickered. The calm hum of Imperial discipline gave way to chaos. The purge had begun. Garro was in the strategium when the first reports came through. Deck fires, hull breaches, gunfire in the lower levels. He didn't hesitate. With his core group of loyalists, less than a company scattered through the decks. He moved fast. His voice rang clear through emergency channels.
This is Captain Garro. The ship is under internal attack. Stay at your posts. Defend yourselves. Trust no one unless they speak my name.
Every hallway became a battlefield. Every bulkhead a question. Who was on the other side? Grulgor led the assault personally. Twisted, grinning, relishing the chaos. He had never liked Garro. Not his loyalty, not his faith, not his refusal to join the lodge. Now he had his excuse. He brought with him traitor Marines, once brothers, now hollow-eyed killers. They moved like predators through the Eisenstein's guts, slaughtering anyone who resisted. Some bore markings unfamiliar to Garro, runes etched into armor, symbols that pulsed faintly in the dark. This was not ambition. This was corruption. Garro fell back with his forces, establishing a strong point around the bridge. Caleb, always at his side, helped coordinate the mortal crew. A few serfs took up arms. They were terrified, but loyal. The ship groaned as internal systems began to fail. Engine power dropped. Geller field readings fluctuated. They couldn't stay here, not with the warp pressing just beyond the hull. They had one chance: escape. Not from the traitors, from this entire cursed fleet. Garro set a course and ordered the Eisenstein to prepare for translation into the Imperium. It was madness. But staying was death. The Eisenstein was bleeding. Whole decks lay in ruin. Fires burned unchecked. Air was thin in some corridors, gone in others. Hull fractures spread like spiderwebs. And through it all, Garro moved like a storm of gray steel. He gave no speeches. There was no time for words. Only orders, only survival. The Loyalists had rallied. Barely more than a few squads remained. Veterans, deck officers, remembrancers, even terrified crewmen who had chosen honor over life. Caleb moved among them like a lifeline, coordinating, relaying, fighting when needed. Garro took command of the ship's heart. Grulgor still held the engine decks. There, he and his corrupted warriors, no longer fully Astartes, no longer fully human, clung to the core systems with rot and iron. The warp had touched them, not completely, but enough to show. Garro had seen the signs before, in Isstvan, in the eyes of the lodge. Now it was spreading through the ship. Corridor by corridor, room by room, Garro led the counteroffensive. Bolt rounds echoed like thunder. Chainswords shrieked. The halls of the Eisenstein became killing grounds. There were no tactics left. Only rage. Only honor. Only the oath that could not be broken. Serve the Emperor. He carved it in blood, in fire, in silence. Every step forward was a cost. The Geller field pulsed erratically. Warp echoes crept in through fractures in reality. Lights flickered and didn't come back on. Vox transmissions became layered with whispers. Something was watching, not from the fleet, from beyond. But Garro refused to look back. He had a heading, a single purpose: flee, survive, warn. The Eisenstein would escape this graveyard fleet, or die trying. And with every traitor he struck down, he made a promise. Terra will know. The order came, clear and final. Translate now. Garro stood at the command lectern, armor scorched, blood on his gauntlets, breath steady despite the chaos. The Eisenstein was barely holding together. but waiting meant death, either by traitor blades or the fleet's guns above. The navigator hesitated. The Geller field was unstable, systems damaged. The risks were enormous. Garro didn't blink. He repeated,
"Now."
Moments later, the warp opened. The ship howled as reality tore. The translation slammed through the hull like a scream from another realm. Lights shattered. Bulkheads groaned. Half the crew fell to the deck, clutching their heads as the sea of madness swallowed the Eisenstein. The warp didn't greet them. It consumed them. Whispers crawled across the walls. Shapes moved through walls. The air thickened with the scent of things unclean. Garro stood firm, sword ready, eyes forward. The worst was still ahead, but the fleet was behind. They had escaped. For now. The warp was not a place. It was a pressure, a hunger. It pressed against the Eisenstein from all sides, whispering through the vents, bleeding into dreams, infecting thoughts. No scream was safe, no silence clean. It began with Solon Decius. He'd been wounded during the fighting, nothing fatal, a gash across the abdomen from one of Grulgor's blades. The apothecaries had treated it, standard procedure. But the wound didn't close. It pulsed. It whispered. Garro noticed first. Decius grew distant, unfocused. His voice trembled. He avoided the others, spent hours staring into the bulkhead. Then came the fever, the spasms, and finally, the marks. Dark veins spreading under his skin. He was mutating, not through science, through blasphemy. The crew whispered about the rot, about shadows that moved without light, about a foul scent that clung to the lower decks. Some claimed they heard chanting when no one was there. Caleb carried his master's orders in silence, shielding crew morale as best he could. But terror had taken root. They were no longer just fleeing a traitor fleet. They were carrying something worse. Garro knew what must come, but he hesitated. Because Decius wasn't just another warrior. He was his brother. And he was dying from something no medicine could cure. The deeper they went into the warp, the more fragile truth became. For the mortal crew, reality bent at the edges. Dreams bled into waking. Voices echoed without source. Entire decks became haunted with presence. And amid that growing darkness, Euphrates Keeler began to change. She had always been sharp, observant, a remembrancer turned witness to atrocity. But now she spoke with certainty, clarity. She claimed to see things no one else could, shapes in the light, fire in the shadows. She began to speak of the Emperor, not as a man, but as a god. And the crew listened. Caleb, ever practical, stayed close to her. He didn't believe easily, but he'd seen too much to call her mad. When she placed her hand upon a fevered crew member and the screaming stopped, he stopped doubting. She wasn't preaching, she was radiating. Garro was torn. He had always held to the imperial truth. No gods, no faith, only reason. But the warp did not obey reason. It obeyed will, corruption, belief. And if the enemy believed in their gods, perhaps the Emperor needed to become one. Keeler never called herself a prophet. But when she spoke, even the walls seemed to listen. Solon Decius was no longer human. His body still wore the armor of the Death Guard. His voice still carried the echo of his oaths. But inside, there was rot, hunger, filth. Nurgle had claimed him. The wound he'd carried had opened like a gateway. Pus ran like tar. His skin cracked and oozed. The air around him thickened. Every breath from his lungs spread a sickness that clung to the metal walls like mold. He didn't scream. He laughed. Soft, wet laughter like bubbling mud. Garro found him in the apothecarion. It had become a tomb. Corpses lay melted. The lights flickered green. The scent was unbearable. And at the center, towering, bloated, dripping with plague, stood what had once been Solon Decius. He greeted Garro by name, spoke of grandfather Nurgle, offered salvation, offered release. There was no hesitation. Garro drew his sword. Their duel was brief, but unforgettable. Decius struck with unnatural strength, bloated limbs tearing through plasteel. But Garro fought with purpose, not fury. This was not revenge. It was a rite, a cleansing. When it was done, the beast collapsed. A final sigh, a whisper of rot. Garro stood over his brother's remains in silence, not in triumph, in mourning. The ship was failing, not just systems, structure, reality, cohesion. The Eisenstein had taken too much. Sabotage, internal war, the infection of the warp. Now, it was breaking apart. The Geller field, that fragile barrier between the material and immaterium, flickered dangerously. Every minute in the warp brought them closer to full breach. Every failure in the machinery meant another inch given to madness. Garro walked the damaged decks, passing ruptured walls and flickering lumen strips. Crew labored at emergency stations. Engineering crews patched holes with scraps and prayers. But it wasn't enough. They were running out of ship. Caleb organized repair teams. His voice, steady despite exhaustion, kept the mortal crew focused. He was not a warrior, but his loyalty was unbreakable. Keeler moved among the wounded, her calm presence keeping panic at bay. She spoke of hope, of survival, of destiny. Garro said little. He watched the readings. He studied the star charts. And he understood the truth. They couldn't hold course much longer. There was one path, one system barely within range, an outpost of the Imperium, a relay station, possibly manned, possibly armed. If they could reach it, they could send a message, a warning, the truth. And if not, they would die trying. The breach was small, a flicker in the Geller field, a pulse, a breath. But that was all it needed. The warp tasted the opening and struck. It came not as a horde, but as a presence. A shadow made of sound, a heat that left frost, a voice that echoed before it spoke. The Eisenstein screamed. Lights shattered, steel warped, gravity fluctuated, decks twisted in impossible angles. Men fell to their knees, clawing at their eyes as their thoughts bent under pressure. And then, something entered. Not a demon. Not at first. Just suggestion. Then shape. Garro stood firm in the strategium as the temperature dropped below freezing. He heard names whispered in the walls. He saw reflections move without him. It wasn't fear he felt. It was intrusion. Like fingers in his mind, pressing against memory. Visions surged. Terra burning, Horus laughing, the Emperor silent on his throne. But Garro pushed back. He did not pray. He did not scream. He commanded. The Geller field was restored, power rerouted, emergency conduits engaged, the breach closed, and the darkness receded. But it had left something behind, Not damage. A message.
You are seen.
The ship had gone silent. After the breach, the crew no screamed. They whispered. The warp had left its mark, not in flesh, but in spirit. Fatigue became despair. Function became survival. Even the Astartes felt it. But something held them together. Keeler. She no longer needed to raise her voice. Her presence alone brought calm. She moved through shattered corridors and makeshift infirmaries with eyes lit by something unseen. She carried no bolter, no blade, only the Aquila, the symbol of the Emperor, raised high, worn on her robes, held in her hand like a relic. And wherever it passed, the air felt lighter. Caleb followed her silently, watching. He did not understand what she was becoming. He only knew that men were standing again, that wounded soldiers looked to her with tears, not fear, that the crew, once ready to give up, now repaired conduits, sealed breaches, and swore oaths with trembling hands. The Emperor's name had become more than law. It had become hope. Garro said nothing of faith, but he saw the change. He did not order it, yet he did not stop it. Because hope, whatever its source, was now a weapon, and they would need it to reach real space, to deliver the warning, to survive. The ship groaned like a dying beast. Every warning light on the bridge flared red. Power was bleeding from secondary systems. Reactor stability was estimated in minutes. And still, Garro stood, gaze locked on the void ahead. The navigator, pale and shaking, gave the signal. Translation point achieved. The warp twisted one final time, and reality slammed back into place. The Eisenstein emerged into the cold black of real space. Scars rippled across its hull. Entire sections were non-functional. Exterior plating glowed from recent energy discharge. But it was there, whole, alive, barely. No one cheered. They exhaled. Crew collapsed at their stations. Tech priests wept from data overload. Astartes removed helmets with trembling hands. Keeler crossed herself in silence. The Aquila held to her chest. Caleb knelt. And Garro? He just whispered,
Terra.
but they weren't at Terra yet. They had translated near Luna 7, a relay and monitoring station of the Imperium. Minimal forces, uncertain allegiance. It would have to be enough. He ordered a distress signal. Encoded, Imperial clearance. Treason. Horus has fallen. Eisenstein requests urgent audience. No guarantee they would believe him. But the message was out. The Eisenstein was met with silence. Then came the boarding teams, armored, cautious, weapons charged. No one trusted the signal. A Death Guard vessel emerging battered from the warp, claiming treason against the War Master? It sounded like madness. But the protocols were followed. Garro stood tall as they were escorted aboard the Imperial relay cruiser. His armor was cracked, scarred, marked with the blood of brothers. Behind him walked Caleb, Keeler, and a few survivors. They didn't look like victors. They looked like witnesses. Rogel Dorn awaited them. Unmoving, a granite presence of fury contained beneath absolute control. The walls around him seemed to harden with his breath. When Garro approached, Dorn's eyes narrowed, not in recognition, but in calculation.
Explain yourself.
Garro told him everything. Isstvan, Horus, Mortarion, the bombing, the betrayal, the flight, the horrors in the warp, Decius, the demon, the faith. Every word weighed like a blow. And when he was done, the silence was worse than before. Dorn did not shout. He didn't rage. He simply turned and issued new orders. The message would reach Terra, and the defenses would be raised. The heresy had been confirmed, but the galaxy had only begun to burn. The transmission reached Terra, coded, authenticated, impossible to deny. Horus had turned. The Great Crusade was broken. The Emperor's most trusted son had begun a war not of conquest, but of annihilation. And now, the Imperium stood at the edge of a blade. Garro did not ask for reward, nor comfort. He only stood, silent, as the machine of Imperial defense stirred from its long, complacent sleep. He had done his duty. He had carried the truth through the madness of the warp, the betrayal of his legion, and the death of a brother. He had warned them, but the path ahead was darker still. The Emperor would not march, not yet. And Horus would not wait. Whole legions would choose sides. Worlds would burn. The galaxy would descend into an age of fire and gods, heresy and martyrdom. And Garro? He had made a vow to fight in the Emperor's name, to carry the light through the shadow, to become a sword without banner, without legion, without mercy. The Eisenstein had not been his tomb. It had been his rebirth. And the war was just beginning.